Croeso, welcome to the Welsh Politics podcast, where we try to get under the surface of what's really going on in Welsh politics. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr Ed Poole from the Wales Governance Centre here at Cardiff University. I'm Laura McAllister, and we're going to be discussing the finances of Welsh Government and the general economic picture in Wales ahead of a deeper dive into this area early in the new year. Ed, tell us a little bit, first of all, how is Wales funded?
Well, thanks, Laura, and thanks for having me on the pod. So actually, the way that Wales is funded is pretty straightforward. So most of the taxes we pay, not all, we'll come on to that maybe, most of the tax we pay are collected essentially at the Westminster level, and then they flow back down via the block grant, which pays for more than half of the services that we benefit from in Wales. So more than half of the services in Wales are provided by the Welsh Government. So that's health, education, rail transport, road transport, and there's some that is still reserved to Westminster. That's mainly pensions, social security benefits, things like that. So the block grant, which is the money that flows down from Westminster to pay for 80% of those Welsh Government services, that's calculated by the infamous Barnett formula.
Right, come on, pause there. You've used a few terms already that lots of us are familiar with, but maybe some people aren't. So just tell us a little bit about the Barnett formula and how that works in relation to the block grant.
Absolutely. So the majority of Wales's funding through the block grant, again, which covers about 80% of everything the Welsh Government spends, we'll come on to devolved taxes later, but still the largest part of Welsh Government funding comes from a block grant, which is a transfer of money every year from Westminster. Now, most of that is untouched from previous years. What is calculated by the Barnett formula is just the year-to-year change. So just what we get this year that we didn't get last year. The Barnett formula was originally set up to be just a temporary plaster, if you like. It originated in the difficult period in the late 1970s when those of you who know your politics of that period will remember that this was a period when there was a proposal for devolution to Scotland and Wales. Some very difficult bills went through the Houses of Parliament at that time, and the government was losing members all the time, and it eventually was voted out of office on a no-confidence measure. But at that time, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, whose name was Joel Barnett, came up with this sticking plaster measure that would find a way to provide money for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland in the event that we had the devolution in 1979. Now, those of you will know that the referendums actually were not successful. In fact, in Wales, it lost 4-1. But despite that, this formula was thought as actually a useful way to try and avoid cabinet disputes over how much money would be sent to Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, to try and take the politics out of it, ironically, by taking it out of having the UK government decide on a year-to-year basis how much to transfer to those three countries.
So we know it was meant to be temporary, but it's been quite the opposite, and there's no real sign, is there, of Barnett being changed. Tell us a little bit why that's the case. I mean, I think we know that this is politics rather than economics.
Yes, yeah. And I should have perhaps also explained how it basically works, because it's very straightforward. It's a population-based formula, not a needs-based formula. So what happens is if a service is deemed to be relatively devolved, so health, education, almost entirely devolved, if expenditure in that area increases in England, then Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland will get a population share of that increase in the same cash terms increase per person. So if there's a new hospital project announced in England, for example, that costs £100 million, that increases the size of the health budget in England, which causes an automatic 5% transfer of new money as a consequence of that spending. So that's why you'll hear them being called Barnett consequentials, because they're a consequence of an increase in spending on something in England that's deemed to be devolved elsewhere.
So why is this formula beneficial to Scotland and Northern Ireland in a way that it isn't to Wales? And we'll come on to some of the nuances of what's happened more recently in Wales, obviously.
Yeah. So this is a formula that's basically been baked in since the 1970s. But for Scotland, it actually was based on a previous formula to Barnett formula, the Goshen formula. It was from the 1880s. So these huge long path dependencies of time. And over time, the population of Scotland has tended to grow less rapidly than the population of England and Wales, but particularly England. Now, what this means is if you have the same cash per person increase in spending in Scotland and England, over time, if England's population grows more rapidly than Scotland's, in Scotland you're going to have to spread those spending increases over fewer people relatively. So over very many decades, slower growing population in Scotland have meant they've been able to build up a per person advantage, per capita advantage in how much they can spend on public services. And that has become quite significant given the number of decades that we're talking about. Because remember, the Barnett formula only deals with the individual changes on year to year. It doesn't touch the largest part of the block grant, which is baked in and doesn't change.
So talking about equity and fairness, some of the big profile issues recently have been over rail spending, HS2 and so on. I mean, they're to do with Barnett consequentials or not having Barnett consequentials. Tell us a little bit about that and why it's so significant.
Absolutely. So it's a population-based share. It's not a needs-based factor. So if we were to look at Scotland's needs relative to Wales, they'd be lower because Wales is the poorest part of the UK in terms of GVA and so on and so forth. It's a historical accident, but also, as you mentioned, the Treasury is judge, jury and executioner on the interpretation of the Barnett formula. So while it's very straightforward in terms of the formula itself, what counts as being devolved or non-devolved is not subject to debate. It's subject to Treasury diktat. So a famous example we have, of course, in Wales is HS2 and rail infrastructure projects. Because that's not deemed to be devolved, it means that the formula isn't switched on those projects. So it means for transport projects as a whole, Wales will receive a much lower Barnett consequential than is the case for Scotland and for Northern Ireland, where rail infrastructure is deemed to be devolved and therefore eligible for that transfer of additional money.
And just to be clear, I mean, the major criticism is levelled at the Treasury because it has a role across a range of functions that are potentially challenging to accountability and democratic accountability to the Welsh Government and so on. But I mean, why would a project like HS2 then be deemed to be England and Wales? What's the process that led to that? Because I'm sure some people would find that quite perplexing.
And they're right to find it quite perplexing. I think the Treasury's reason for doing this is that back in the St David's Day process, back in the mid-2010s, there was a question about whether rail infrastructure should be devolved. It was deemed by the parties at that time that it shouldn't be devolved, whereas rail operations, so Transport for Wales, the trains, operations, that was devolved. So what's happened in that view is that because rail infrastructure remains reserved to Westminster, then all rail projects should deem to be England and Wales. So for the Treasury, it's probably an annoyance that they have to keep asking questions about whether a certain rail project that is only for England is deemed to be devolved. The problem with that is they're not consistent. So Crossrail, which, as everybody will know, the Elizabeth line, it's only an England-only project, but that was deemed eligible for Barnett consequentials, and so was a small element of spending for the East-West Rail project, which links Oxford and Cambridge. So the challenge here is that the Treasury explanation and the UK government explanation from whatever colour is not actually consistent. And so that's where the frustration lies, is because you can show examples of where this theory of why this shouldn't be devolved has not been applied, and you don't get an answer as to that.
Okay, well, it leads us to a recent report that you and Gito and your colleagues at the Wales Governance Centre have produced around the Welsh Fiscal Framework Agreement. And you talked in that, didn't you, about that there had been budgetary gains from Barnettised funds and so on. So tell us what was new and novel around this.
Absolutely. Now, so again, those of you, the listeners that might have know their onions on public finance, about 15 years ago, very important report in Wales called the Holtham Report. And then it was followed by the Silk Commission report. I mention that only because the Holtham Commission was the first to really evidence that Wales was being badly done by the Barnett formula. Now that happens because of what I mentioned earlier is because the same spending increase in England will trigger the same cash terms, the same exact cash terms increase on a proportional basis to Wales. Now, what that means is, let me give you an example. Say you've got a friend who's got £100 in the bank ready to spend. You've got the second friend with £200 in the bank. If you give the first friend another £10, that's a 10% increase. But if you give the second friend £10, that's only a 5% increase. You can see those as analogous to England and the other countries of the UK. If the other countries of the UK have a higher starting point in terms of their relative spending per person, it means over time the same cash increases, if you give those to those three countries, are going to be smaller increases than those increases for England. That's designed in the formula. It's called the Barnett squeeze. And over many decades, it means that the relative funding advantage for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland will converge down to that of England. And particularly if you have a larger lead, if you like, over England to start with, Scotland and Northern Ireland, that squeeze can be actually quite significant.
What about the argument that Silk put forward around tax devolution enhancing accountability? I mean, are we closer to that? I mean, tell us about the devolved tax base, if you like, and has there been progress that would validate the Silk claim that there would be enhanced accountability from this process?
Yeah, so there's two things that I think are paradoxically but equally true. It's been a huge budgetary benefit on the one hand, but I don't think at all transformative for accountability. It's been useful for the purposes of the Welsh budget because of the UK policy decisions over income tax. Now, about 20% of the Welsh budget is now devolved. The largest component of that is the Welsh rates of income tax, which are 10 pence of the basic rate, 10 pence of the higher rate, and 10 pence of the additional rate. So half of the basic rate revenue, if you pay basic rate taxes, half of that is going straight to the Welsh government. Over time, the UK government has frozen the thresholds. Now, what that means is that the level of income at which you start paying the basic rate of income tax, about 12,500, the rate at which you start paying the higher rate of income, and the level of income that you start paying the additional rate, those have been frozen. And quite famously, a couple of weeks ago in the UK budget, Rachel Reeves again froze the thresholds for another 3 years. Now that's important because in Wales, we have a much larger group of people who are around about the personal allowance level, the £12,500 amount of income per year when people start paying income tax. Now that means that proportionately more Welsh people have started paying income tax relative to the rest of the UK. So for the Welsh budget, this has actually increased revenues relative to a system in which taxes hadn't been devolved. It's about £500 million per year more money into the Welsh budget as a result of that single change in the devolved income taxes. So that has been a budget boost, even though, of course, the Welsh Government has not used its powers. They've not changed the rates at all since they were introduced in 2019. And I think politically, there's been very little change. There's very few people talk about using the thresholds, but using the rate setting powers, particularly if they're in government. But we've had really difficult budgets. So the question is, if you're not going to use income tax powers when the budget is really tight, when are you ever going to use these powers?
And there's a difference between Scotland and Wales, obviously, in terms of the scope to manage income tax. Why is that? And are we just purely talking about politics again? And should there be a commonality in terms of the scope that Scotland and Wales have to manage the devolved tax base?
So ironically, the longest lasting legacy of the Calman Commission for Scotland, which was set up by unionist parties to try and offer a new set of fiscal powers and tax powers for Scotland way back in the Brown government, the longest lasting legacy of that has been the Welsh tax system. So what happened, of course, in the mid-2010s with the Scottish independence referendum and that famous vow, right, that the UK government would offer more powers for the Scottish Parliament if Scotland were to vote no and stay in the UK. Of course, that did happen. And from from a situation in which Scotland had our tax system, it then moved to a system in which all income tax over earned income is now devolved to Scotland. What's also important is not only is it 100% of earned income that is a Scottish tax, but Scotland has powers to vary the thresholds, which is to change the levels at which people start paying taxes at different levels of income. Now that's important because Scotland's now introduced 6 thresholds. We have the England and Wales system, which is 3 bands. Now, what that means is that they're able to more neatly tailor a tax system to account for a population that's earning a little bit less than maybe the case in South East England. So we certainly have that in Wales. Almost all of the income tax in Wales is earned on the basic rate, on that 20p rate, of which 10 pence is for the Welsh Government. It's not really a useful tool, and so certainly having threshold powers would be absolutely something we want to do. And I think you're right. I think this is fundamentally about politics, and the response to the independence referendum by the Smith Commission and the Scotland Act 2016 was to have a much fuller tax system in Scotland. I think based on the performance here in Wales, remember, we're £500 million up a year on a situation in which we wouldn't have had tax devolution. Based on that performance, I think we'd be very confident at saying, if Scotland, then why not Wales?
And if you strip away the detail, which is really interesting to all of us, there's a principle at this, isn't there, which I think was raised right at the very beginning of devolution, even by the Richard Commission, which is now 20 years ago, which was that having control over finance, especially taxation, is an opportunity to connect better with the public and to ensure that there is a stronger strand of accountability in all democratic decision making. So it's almost like you can't have half of that really without people questioning what the logic is. And it does seem that we've got bits and pieces of devolved taxation without having a strategic overview. I mean, what do you think needs to happen to ensure that there is a more cohesive and more coherent, I guess, model of financing the work that the Welsh Government does?
I mean, that's a really tough question because it requires changing the way in which the UK government has approached devolution. The Treasury in particular has wanted to do all of this on a bilateral basis. Every single deal, whether it be to the 3 devolved governments or to any of the new mayoral combined authorities in England, they're all done on a bilateral basis. There's no strategy on how this might be a unified approach across the UK. It seems to be an anathema to the Treasury to do this. So I think to have that strategic view, I think we'd have to have a completely different attitude towards the way that devolution should work across the UK.
We'll come back on to the budgets, UK budget and the Welsh budget, because obviously that's in people's minds now. But just staying with this kind of uneven terrain economically and politically across the UK. I mean, when we worked on the Independent Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales, one of the recommendations was that the kind of financial micromanagement that the Treasury exhibits towards Wales, over things like in-year spend and so on, over borrowing and everything else. Tell us, explain to us why that's important, and why. I mean, I appreciate this is a legacy, but what problems does it cause to Welsh Government in terms of how it manages its finance and its budget?
Yeah, and this is a problem that is just carries over administration after administration of whatever political colour. So we've got, there's several things going on in this space. We've got, one of the recent examples is this new Pride of Place fund, which carries directly over from the Towns Fund from the Conservatives in the sense that we're going to have, MPs involved in the distribution of these funds rather than the Welsh Government, which has policy responsibility for economic development. So we've got all these bypasses going on for political purposes. I think on the questions of Treasury involvement in things like HS2, right? That it's just deciding that this is going to be an England and Wales project when we've got examples elsewhere in England of that not being the case. I think in terms of the Welsh budget, the biggest areas in which there's limitations imposed by the Treasury are on the the Welsh Reserve, the Wales Reserve, which is the amount of money that Wales can put away for a rainy day and carry into the next year, and also over the amount that Wales can borrow for capital investment purposes. Both of these are really limited. In fact, since it was set up a decade ago, the Wales Reserve of 350 million has been reducing in terms of its value because of inflation over time. So in fact, the Welsh Government has less ability to carry forward money into another year than a small Whitehall department like the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. Now, why would the Welsh Government want to put money away for another year? Might be a question. Why isn't it spending it now? Well, sometimes money can come through Barnett consequentials very late in the year. There can be a spending triggered in England that transfers money into Wales within a couple of weeks from the end of the financial year. So it means at that point, the Welsh Government is scrabbling around for ways to cash cannon it out of the door.
Which is pretty unstrategic.
It's very unstrategic.
Yeah. What about the other thing that we considered in the Commission was when there was a big in-year investment, even if it was earlier in the budgetary cycle, but that creates difficulties for Welsh Gov, doesn't it?
It does. And we already have multiple supplementary budgets every single year to reprogram money that's coming in from Barnett consequentials, in-year transfers of cash. We already have 4 budgets a year, at least. This year we're probably going to have 5. A draft budget, an outline draft budget, a draft budget, a final budget, and 2 supplementary budgets.
And the implications of that for the key public service delivery agencies is quite something, isn't it?
It is.
Whether that's local government or health boards or anyone, really.
That's right. I mean, the Welsh Government's biggest policy area of responsibility, more than 50% of the budget, is the NHS, which is, the NHS does not operate on a day-to-day, it operates on, long timelines in terms of investment. And having this system, DCMS is doing important things, but it's not running a multi-year health service, which is what the Welsh Government is doing. There needs to be much more flexibility on the ability to carry forward money. There also needs to be much more flexibility on the Welsh Government's ability to borrow. Again, we've got a fixed limit of £1 billion, which in total debt. That's just tiny amounts of money.
That's minuscule.
Minuscule.
Again, I think I know the answer to this, but why? What is the opposition to making that a more credible sum that would allow Welsh Government to be strategic about borrowing, for whatever capital projects it wishes?
Because because the Treasury wants to control the public expenditure envelope of the UK. They want to be sure that we don't have lots of borrowing going on that's going to threaten the UK's position with the famous bond markets, if you like. That UK government borrowing must be managed centrally and subject to that.
But Scotland's cap is
much higher,
more generous in those terms.
It is. And it's allowed to increase for inflation, which Wales is not.
Which is a significant change.
Yes.
Okay, and tell us about the UK budget then, the Reeves budget. I mean, what was in it for Wales? We've heard lots of analysis, but from a kind of top-line perspective, what were the big themes that were either beneficial or detrimental to Wales?
Yeah, I think it's partly continuing what we saw from the Conservative budget. In other words, front-loading spending and having kind of penciled-in tax cuts and public spending cuts towards the end of that period for the 5-year multi-period. So in the sense, there's not a huge amount of change.
No.
There was what was important is there weren't massive public expenditure cuts. What the Treasury, what the Chancellor had to find was money to fund the U-turns over the welfare cuts that had been penciled in over the summer, and she also had to find money to remove the 2-child limit So there was a lot of money needed to be found. But there's still the problem in the out years where there's a lot of uncertainty about tax increases and public spending cuts. The way that this was paid for was it'd been trialled that there would be that there would be a 2 pence increase on income tax. That was not introduced. Instead, the thresholds were frozen, which of course pulls more people into paying incomes at a higher band because of wage growth, because of inflation. Over time, people are dragged into paying one of the higher bands. That's called actually fiscal drag.
Yeah, okay. And that has a worse effect on Wales than it does on the rest of the UK.
It does. Wales has more taxpayers at around the start, the amount of money which they start paying income tax.
Okay. Let's move on to the Welsh budget, because obviously we've recently seen a deal struck between Welsh Labour and Plaid Cymru. I said quite a long while ago on the pod that I didn't think anything other than that would happen, for political rather than financial reasons. But what's your take on the deal that Plaid has won, if you like, from its cooperation with passing this budget? I mean, it seems to me that it's all directed towards frontline services. Yeah. Is there anything really meaty in that, or is it a simple win-win for the two parties?
I think it's that. I think it's the second. I think that there's no rabbits out of hats here. There's still a tight budget, but what's the money has gone into local governments. So that's about £113 million additional. That's equivalent to about a 5% increase in council tax. So it's not small change for local government.
So it relieves the pressure, basically, on local government, because otherwise they'd have to increase council tax.
Yeah, and we'll still likely see council tax
but not by
increase,
the same amount.
Not by the same amount.
Okay.
And also the largest amount of money was put into the health service. That had been on course for a really historically low increase. Now, it's still not a great increase, but it's more in line with historical averages. Yeah. So there's no rabbits being pulled out of hats, but it's a kind of more of the same, move it forward to the end of this Senedd term, I think.
And it tells us where we are in the electoral cycle, I guess, doesn't it? Because with Plaid Cymru doing well in the polls and anticipating being either in government as the lead party or in government in some other capacity, there's nothing to be gained from not having a workable budget to inherit post-May elections.
No, there's nothing to be gained and plenty to be lost.
Yes,
from that approach.
Yeah, quite. Yeah. Okay, just thinking about the comparisons with Scotland for a moment, because I wanted to go back to that, because it's been very hard for Wales to get any kind of traction about the fairness of the situation. And I think it's unfair of me to ask you, how fair is the funding settlement? You've given us plenty of data that shows where the problems are with this. But what are the prospects for improvements in the budgetary arrangements in the UK? I take your point that this is unlikely to be looked at in a holistic manner because there's too many political dynamics which are potentially contradicting each other. But I mean, the logicality of potential future devolution of areas like rail infrastructure or Crown Estate or energy or other areas. What can you see happening in the next sort of short to medium term in terms of the financial arrangements?
In the short term, like this, I'll come back to the second point about potential additional devolved functions, if I may. In the short term, the relative situation of Wales under the Barnett formula has improved quite a bit since over the past 15 years. There's been two reasons for that. One is austerity, and so when we had previous large increases in the budget, which reduced Wales's advantage down to England, under austerity that goes in reverse. So convergence in per capita funding becomes divergence in per capita funding. So we've had a movement away from the risk of being squeezed way down to England's level. We've also had a negotiation to change the Barnett formula. So about a decade ago, to operationalise all of these new taxes that were being devolved to Wales, of which income tax is the most important one, there's a new agreement between the Treasury and the Welsh Government called the Fiscal Framework. One of the elements of that was to add 5%, an additional multiplier, which is called the needs-based multiplier.
So that's effectively 105% then of the... Okay.
So everything we'd got previous from those per capita transfers, but cash transfers from being triggered by a spending increase on public services in England that are devolved to Wales, that's now 105% of what they would have been. That has added about £500 million into the Welsh budget. So that's another £500 million from the income tax devolution I mentioned a while ago. So there's been two big positive developments. So it is not as bad a situation as we were facing about 15 years ago for two different reasons. So there has been improvement, but there's still more improvements that could be made. As you mentioned, there's little prospect, I think, for having a trans-UK deal, because if you went to a needs-based formula, that we wouldn't even be certain of improving the situation in Wales, but it would not improve the situation in Scotland.
Yeah.
So I think the Treasury and probably the Scottish Government and probably the Northern Ireland Executive would prefer bilateralism rather than a cross-UK multilateral view, strategic view at all of this. I think when we're looking at potential additional services to devolve, most of them would have would be very easy to do so. There'd be some more complex things like the prison service. We'd have to divide up the prison's estate, but it could be done. What is very straightforward would be the Crown Estate. You're just carving off a geographic area in terms of the lease revenues. Very straightforward would be police, because they're already in police force areas that are currently run by the PCCs and by the crime panels. That's a very easy straightforward division from the Home Office to the Welsh Government if that were to be made, and police grant that goes to those 4 areas could simply be transferred to the Welsh Government. So there's some really easy areas in which you could devolve. I think in terms of the potential changes I'd like to see in terms of the Barnett formula, I'd want to have the decisions over the Treasury much more scrutinised and subject to appeal and arbitration, because we're banging our heads against the wall on very significant projects that we're losing out from.
And it makes no sense. I was going to finish with that point about the Treasury, but it makes no sense, does it? Because the Welsh Government has its own accountability and scrutiny requirements, with the committees of the Senedd and obviously with the challenge from backbenchers and so on. So it has its scrutiny environment anyway, and yet the Treasury is almost superimposing another challenge to Welsh Government spending, but without any recourse to challenge to itself.
That's right.
I mean, that makes no sense in any governance framework whatsoever, does it? And I feel like we're saying the same thing without reaching a conclusion here. But how on earth is the next step towards unravelling the Treasury's omnipotence going to happen? Because at the moment we're making very little traction with anything that Welsh Gov asks of.
No.
In this case, a friendly UK Gov, never mind an unfriendly one. So is there any hope of any of this changing, or are we just whistling in the wind?
I mean, I think, again, that's a broad question in terms of a UK-wide approach. There's been many different contributions over the years that say that the Treasury should be reformed, maybe creating a finance department, an economy department. This has just been the way that the British government has worked for centuries. And so, actually that's potentially more fundamental a change than devolution was in the 1990s. I mean, certainly at the moment, the challenges for Wales aren't on the Barnett formula anymore. The challenges are on the reserved funding side.
Yes.
So we're below a population share for reserved spending. We're above it for devolved spending. So in that context, actually, the more Barnett, the better. The more things that we can transfer from a reserved function into a devolved function, actually, the better off Wales will be. But that again is running into the politics of devolution about do people want to devolve the police, devolve the Crown Estate. All of those could make a difference.
And I suppose in some respects, maybe this is an unfair question to ask you, but in some respects, the fact that the financial return from devolving some of those areas is more enhanced than it would have been maybe a decade ago is another selling point for why devolution might happen. Because traditionally, when we've talked about justice, devolution, criminal justice in the broader sense, people have said, well, without the funding, the justice system wouldn't be sustained in the way it is now. But I guess through your argument is that if things are devolved, then there's a greater chance of them having the requisite funding to be able to improve and be delivered more effectively.
That's correct. It's a safer place for Wales's position to be protected. And again, that goes back for the original point back in the 70s. To take the arguments of the cabinet table on how much Wales should be funded. I mean, we saw that in the spending review, and the dispute over that 445 million of rail investment spending. That's 1%. Of a population share. It's way off what would be provided via a Barnett consequential. And we can argue about rounding errors here, but it's far off what would be transferred to Wales under the Scottish model. And so that I think is the where I'd like to see is much more openness and awareness of Wales's relative funding, not only for devolved services, which we know of, but actually for reserved services. What percentage of justice spending
equally important,
is equally important? It's very difficult to find information
And I
about
guess
it.
in the current climate where you have a UK Labour government and a Welsh Labour government, the more these arguments are rehearsed in public, the more sense there is amongst the general public that some aspects of this are unfair, the more problematic it is politically as well, which, gives one some indication that things might at least get tense in the future, if not ready for change.
I think so. I mean, and as we've been talking, it's not all bad. There's nuances here. But certainly in terms of a lot of the areas, and I think particularly it's right for there to be a focus on rail infrastructure spending and on justice spending. These are areas in which we have very poor outcomes in Wales for different reasons. It's right that there should be scrutiny on the shares of these public investments, if you like, that are going to Wales.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Ed.
Croeso.
And thank you for joining us for another Welsh Politics podcast. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, please rate us, please follow us, please give us some of your comments in return and spread the word. Follow us on socials and be part of the conversation. We always welcome your questions and answers, and we'll be back again with another pod soon. Diolch yn fawr.